The camera pans through a sleek, modern corporate office. Polished floors that reflect the stark white walls, with clean lines and towering windows offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. The air is thick with tension, the kind that always lingers before an important presentation. The hum of fluorescent lights above, the soft tapping of fingers on keyboards, and the rustling of papers fill the silence. At a large, polished conference table sits Daniel, a black man in his early 30s, dressed sharply in a well-tailored suit that contrasts with the sterile, almost corporate monotony of the room. His fingers lightly tap the surface of the table, rhythmically but with purpose, as he watches the team before him. They are mostly white, well-dressed, and silently awaiting the presentation. The tension in the air is palpable. It's as if everyone knows this meeting is more than just about business. It's about something far deeper. Daniel clears his throat, pushing his nerves aside. He shifts his papers, his eyes scanning the room. His heart races, but he's used to this, being the only black person in a room full of predominantly white faces. His every move scrutinized. The weight of the moment presses on him, but he's prepared. He's worked tirelessly on the initiative, the one that could change everything for the company, something groundbreaking. His idea could potentially reshape the trajectory of the business, and Daniel knows it. He wants to do this. He has to. As he prepares to speak, the door to the conference room opens with a sharp click. The room immediately goes still. All eyes shift to the man entering the room, Mr. Thompson, the CEO. In his 40s, tall, with graying hair at his temples and a face carved into one of arrogance, Mr. Thompson exudes an air of superiority. His expensive suit fits him perfectly, but it's his icy glare and cold demeanor that make the room feel smaller, as if his presence consumes it entirely. Let's get this over with. Mr. Thompson's voice cuts through the silence like a blade as he strides to the head of the table, his eyes not once leaving Daniel. He doesn't bother with a greeting, just an almost dismissive glance as he settles in his chair. The rest of the team follows suit, their eyes flicking between Daniel and Mr. Thompson, sensing the tension and waiting for what will come next. Daniel stands up, forcing himself to steady his hands, knowing that this moment will either be the breakthrough he's been waiting for, or the moment he is dismissed, his work ignored. The team is quiet, their eyes fixed on him, some with interest, others with skepticism. Daniel doesn't falter. He begins to speak, his voice steady but laced with a slight tremor. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. Today, I'll be presenting a proposal that I believe will change the way this company approaches our next phase of growth. Daniel begins, laying the foundation for his groundbreaking initiative. He moves with confidence as he walks toward the presentation screen, the click of the remote in his hand the only sound breaking the silence. The room watches intently as the slides begin to appear on the screen, charts, projections, and strategies that could potentially revolutionize the way the company operates. Daniel talks through the plan with passion, his eyes lighting up as he discusses the details. He sees the skepticism in some faces, the hesitation in others, but he powers through. This is his moment. He knows it, and for the first time the room feels like it's listening. But as he approaches the final point of his presentation, a soft chuckle cuts through the air. Daniel falters for a second, his eyes flashing to Mr. Thompson, who is sitting back, arms crossed, a smug grin on his face. Let me get this straight, Mr. Thompson interjects, his tone dripping with condescension. You think your little plan is going to change the future of this company. His voice is raised just enough for the rest of the team to hear, but quiet enough to maintain control over the room. The smirk never leaves his face as he looks down at Daniel. "You're really going to stand there and tell us that you've got all the answers?" The room falls into a heavy silence. Daniel's pulse quickens, but he refuses to shrink back. This is his moment, and no matter how big the man in front of him is, Daniel isn't backing down. Daniel stood tall, his hands clasped in front of him, as he continued explaining his proposal, his voice steady and confident. He spoke clearly, presenting each point with precision and authority, his words carefully crafted to show how his idea would lead the company toward new growth. His passion for the project was undeniable, and as he scanned the room, he could see the faintest glimmer of interest in the eyes of some team members. But as he reached the pivotal moment in his presentation, explaining the core strategy for expanding the company's market share, he was cut off mid-sentence by a sharp, condescending voice. "This is way above your level, Daniel," Mr. Thompson interjected, his words cold and dismissive. "Maybe you should let the real professionals handle this." The room immediately fell into an unnatural silence. The words, deliberate and sharp, hung in the air like a heavy cloud. The team's eyes flicked between Daniel and their boss, some averting their gaze, others squirming in their seats, uncomfortable with the hostility that was suddenly palpable. Daniel's heart pounded, but he forced himself to keep his posture straight. He hadn't expected the challenge to come this soon, but he wasn't backing down. "Excuse me." Daniel's voice was calm but firm, refusing to show any sign of weakness. Mr. Thompson, unfazed, leaned back in his chair with an air of superiority. "You heard me," he said, his words dripping with disdain. "You may have a nice idea, but this project, this level of work, is for people who understand how things really work in the business world. Maybe someone of your background wouldn't quite get it." The words stung like daggers, but Daniel kept his face neutral, unwilling to give Mr. Thompson the satisfaction of seeing his hurt. His fists, however, clenched beneath the table, betraying the storm of anger brewing inside him. His body was tense, but he refused to show fear. The team grew increasingly uncomfortable, the silence stretching on, broken only by the soft tapping of a pen in someone's nervous hands. No one said a word. No one stepped forward to challenge Mr. Thompson. They had all heard about his ruthlessness, but to witness it firsthand was something else entirely. Mr. Thompson, sensing his power in the moment, leaned forward slightly, his gaze narrowing on Daniel as if daring him to respond. "This project is too advanced for you, Daniel," he said, his voice now colder. "Stick to your usual tasks, filing reports, managing spreadsheets, and leave the big ideas to someone who can actually handle them." Daniel's jaw tightened as Mr. Thompson threw a dismissive glance at him, almost as if he were a nuisance, an obstacle in the room that didn't belong. The degrading words sliced through him, and for a brief moment, it felt as if the entire room had become smaller, colder, and more suffocating. The uncomfortable weight of systemic bias settled in Daniel's chest like a heavy stone. His heart raced, but he knew that showing his anger would only feed the flames. Still, the silent rage inside him bubbled, ready to burst. He had fought his way to this point in his career, working harder than anyone else to earn his seat at the table. But no matter how hard he tried, no matter how much he succeeded, there would always be someone who didn't think he deserved it. Someone who would never see him as equal, despite his skills, his achievements, and his undeniable potential. The silence in the room deepened, the unspoken truth hanging in the air. Daniel wasn't just being judged for his ideas. He was being judged for who he was, and Mr. Thompson's words made that clear. In that moment, Daniel knew that this fight wasn't just for respect. It was for the right to exist in this space, to have his voice heard, and to be treated with the dignity he deserved. The moment Mr. Thompson's words sliced through the air, Daniel's entire body tensed. He felt the heat rush to his face, his heart pounding in his chest. Every muscle in his body seemed to stiffen, his mind screaming to fight back. How dare he? The question echoed in his mind like a drumbeat. He had been through this before. Dismissed, belittled, underestimated. But this time, it felt different. As the words lingered in the air, Daniel's breath quickened. He was back in that classroom, a child once again, fighting to be heard, fighting to be seen. He remembered the faces of teachers who questioned his potential, the whispers in hallways when he was the only black kid in the honors class. "You're not good enough." He had heard those words more times than he could count. Every instance, every rejection had built up, creating a storm of anger within him that threatened to burst free. But today, something was different. He was different. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment, summoning every ounce of strength he had. He wasn't going to let this man, this room, or this system break him. He had fought too hard to get here, to be heard, to be seen for who he was. His mind flashed to his childhood, the struggles of growing up in a world that constantly told him he was less than. But the boy, who had been rejected time and time again, was no longer the man who sat in this room. He took a slow, steadying breath, letting the silence of the room wash over him. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to lash out. Without saying a word, Daniel stood tall and walked back to his seat, his steps deliberate and calm. As he sat down, the weight of the moment pressed against his chest, but he didn't break. He kept his eyes forward, his expression unwavering. The room was heavy with tension, the silent judgment of the others pressing down on him. "I'll show you," Daniel said quietly, his voice calm but resolute. The words hung in the air, soft but powerful. And as soon as he spoke, the energy in the room shifted. The team sat in stunned silence. Some of them, the ones who had witnessed Daniel's brilliance in the past, exchanged nervous glances. They had seen him deliver presentations that were far more effective than anything their boss had ever managed. They had seen him work tirelessly, often behind the scenes, to bring ideas to life, ideas that made this company better. And now, they saw the man who had always kept his head down, silently bearing the weight of their unspoken biases, finally stand up for himself. The other team members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of how to react. Some of them had always respected Daniel's ideas, but they had never truly seen the battle he had been fighting beneath the surface. They hadn't realized the weight he carried on his shoulders, the weight of being constantly underestimated. They had been complicit in the silence, letting Daniel prove himself over and over, never speaking up, never challenging the bias that was right in front of them. The tension in the room was palpable now, and the uncomfortable silence grew louder with each passing second. Mr. Thompson's expression remained hard, but even he seemed taken aback. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. The room felt charged, as if everyone was waiting for the inevitable explosion, an explosion that didn't come. Instead, Daniel sat back, calm and unyielding. This wasn't just a business meeting. This was a moment that would define Daniel's place in this world. And he wasn't going to let anyone, least of all someone like Mr. Thompson, tell him he didn't belong. The meeting dragged on. Mr. Thompson continuing to belittle Daniel's efforts, his voice dripping with mockery. "This project is too risky," he said, shaking his head dismissively. "You've got big ideas, Daniel, but you clearly don't understand the kind of risk this company is willing to take. Stick to what you know." Daniel sat there, his jaw clenched, his fists tightening in his lap. He had heard enough. He had taken the abuse for too long, his intelligence dismissed, his passion ridiculed, his worth questioned simply because of who he was. The moment had come. Without a word, Daniel stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The room quieted, and all eyes turned toward him. With a calm, deliberate motion, he removed his jacket, letting it fall onto the back of his chair. The team looked on in confusion, unsure of what he was doing. Daniel reached into his inside pocket, pulling out a small object and placing it in front of him on the table. It gleamed under the harsh office lighting, a small silver badge. The room fell completely silent. The familiar logo was unmistakable. It was an FBI badge. Mr. Thompson's smirk faltered as his eyes widened in disbelief. "What the hell is this?" he asked, his voice suddenly shaking. Daniel's gaze never wavered from Mr. Thompson's eyes. His voice was calm, but each word carried the weight of his years of silent struggle. "What you don't know, Mr. Thompson, is that I'm not just any employee here. I've been undercover in this company for months, investigating corporate corruption." The faces around the table shifted from confusion to shock. No one spoke. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating. Daniel could feel their discomfort, their growing realization of the truth. Mr. Thompson, for the first time in the meeting, looked less like the confident CEO and more like a man caught in a trap. Daniel leaned forward, his voice firm. "You've been playing a game with people's lives, and I've been watching. Every word you've spoken today has been recorded." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Daniel's statement hung in the air like a thunderstorm about to break. He placed his hands flat on the table, locking eyes with the team, his voice rising with quiet strength. "You think you can humiliate me because of my skin? Think again." His words were sharp, cutting through the stillness of the room. "You're all complicit. You allowed this to happen. You allowed him to tear people down and pretend there would be no consequences." The camera lingered on the shocked faces of the team. Emma, Jack, even Madison. They were all wide-eyed, now fully aware of the truth. The discomfort was palpable, their guilt hanging over them like an anchor. Mr. Thompson's attempt to regain control was pathetic. This is ridiculous," he sputtered, his hands clenching into fists. "You can't just—" But the words died in his throat. It was too late. The power had shifted. Daniel's calm presence, his unwavering confidence, stood as undeniable evidence of the truth. He had taken everything Mr. Thompson had thrown at him, and now he was in control. The silence in the room was deafening as Daniel stood there, unyielding. The team couldn't look away. They had just witnessed something impossible to ignore. The truth had been revealed. Mr. Thompson's face drained of color as Daniel's words settled in the room. For a moment, the CEO just stared at the badge on the table, his arrogance and control faltering under the weight of the revelation. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as the realization of what was happening sank in. Wait, are you joking?" Mr. Thompson's voice trembled slightly, betraying the panic that had started to take root. "This is some kind of joke, right? You're not really an FBI agent." Daniel didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his posture unwavering. "I'm not joking, Mr. Thompson. he replied firmly. "You've been using this company for personal gain. The people you've hurt, the lives you've ruined, they'll finally get their justice. And you won't be able to hide behind your power anymore." The room fell into a tense silence, but the shift in the atmosphere was undeniable. The team, who had been passive observers up until this point, now felt the heat of the situation. Their eyes flickered between Daniel and their boss, and the uncomfortable realization of complicity began to settle in. Finally, it was Emma who spoke up. "Daniel's right," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "We've all seen the way you've treated people here, Mr. Thompson. We've seen the shady deals, the manipulation, and the favoritism. It's not just him you've been hurting. It's all of us." Jack, his hands shaking slightly, added, "You've been running this company like a dictatorship. You've exploited us, and we've all been afraid to speak up. But not anymore." Madison, too, broke her silence. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by a simmering anger. "I didn't want to admit it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But you've been toxic to everyone here. I was too scared to say anything, but you don't deserve to run this company." Each voice, each confession, began to add weight to the truth. One by one, the team members began to speak up, no longer afraid of the toxic environment that had been cultivated under Mr. Thompson's leadership. They began denouncing his behavior, openly supporting Daniel's investigation, and challenging the toxic power dynamic that had stifled their voices for so long. Mr. Thompson's face twisted in disbelief as his grip on the room slipped further away. His empire of control, built on fear and manipulation, was crumbling before his eyes. "You don't understand," he spat, his voice shaky but defensive. "I built this company. It's mine." Daniel's gaze never wavered. "Not anymore," he said coldly. "It was never yours to begin with. It belongs to the people you've been exploiting." The weight of his words hung in the room like an executioner's axe. Mr. Thompson's arrogance, his reign of power, had come to an end. His empire was no longer his to command, and the consequences of his actions were unfolding in front of him, unstoppable and final. His face flushed with fury, but the silence that followed was final. The damage was done. The room had turned against him. For the first time, Mr. Thompson realized he had lost control. Within hours of Daniel's revelation, the walls of Mr. Thompson's empire began to crumble. News of the corporate corruption spread like wildfire, fueled by Daniel's airtight investigation and the support of the team members, who had finally found their voices. The media reported on the FBI's involvement, and the truth of the company's exploitative practices, led by Mr. Thompson's greed and abuse of power, was revealed to the world. Arrests followed swiftly, and Mr. Thompson was among the first to be taken into custody, facing criminal charges for his role in the corruption and exploitation that had tainted the company for years. His wealth, once his shield, couldn't protect him from the consequences of his actions. His smug face, once full of arrogance and confidence, was now replaced with one of desperation as the law caught up with him. As the news broke, the company was forced to make swift and drastic changes. A new leadership team was appointed, one that promised transparency and fairness. The board committed to creating a more diverse and inclusive workplace, implementing policies to ensure the protection and fair treatment of all employees, regardless of race or background. The company had no choice but to restructure from the inside out, the old guard falling and a new era beginning. But amid the chaos and the fallout, Daniel's role in exposing the truth couldn't be ignored. He had not only uncovered the corruption, but had stood strong in the face of humiliation and prejudice. He had faced down a man who had tried to crush his spirit, and in doing so had sparked a change that would affect not just the company, but the lives of everyone within it. Daniel walked out of the office that day, his head held high. The weight of everything that had happened pressed on him, but he didn't feel burdened. He felt free. He wasn't just a victim of the system anymore. He was a hero who had brought justice to a broken institution. His pride in that moment wasn't just about the success of his investigation, but about the quiet, unyielding strength he had shown to the world. That evening, Daniel returned to his family's home. His mother, who had been through so much with him, looked at him with pride in her eyes. She didn't need to ask what had happened. She could see it in his face. "This is only the beginning," Daniel said softly, standing by the door. "I won't let them win." His mother nodded, the weight of his words settling in. She had raised him to stand up for what was right, to fight for justice, and now she was witnessing that lesson come to life. Daniel turned, walking toward the future, his future. And this time, it was one he would build with his own hands, never letting anyone push him back again.